Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we are going to talk about setting up pulls in Mythic Plus. This includes talking about the standard opener, going over multi-group pull considerations, reviewing the tools at our disposal, and ending in some example footage of pull setups. I'm going to begin by going over what our standard action priorities are whenever we are in combat. Quick disclaimer, in order to fit everything onto one slide, I needed to simplify our standard priority a bit. First, we want a Death Strike for survivability when we are low on health. This priority is shaded in red because it's hopefully not something we'll need to worry about during pull setup. Second, we want to generate some initial Bone Shield stacks so we can get the basic benefits of Bone Shield, which is a significant armor buff along with a haste buff. This can either be achieved with a single Mara Rend, casting Dancing Rune Weapon while using the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary, or Abomination Limb if we are Necrolord. In an ideal scenario, we would even have Bone Shield stacks from the previous pull, allowing us to ignore this step completely. Third, we want to establish initial AoE threat on all enemies to guarantee that everything is actually attacking us and not our party members. Delaying this step by more than a single global cooldown means that we may be putting our allies at risk. The standard way we can do this is by using Blood Boil, though the Covenant abilities Swarming Mist and Abomination Limb can also be used to accomplish this priority. One nice thing about Necrolord in particular is that you can generate initial Bone Shield charges and initial AoE threat using the same global cooldown. Fourth, we want to use Death Strike if it's needed to avoid capping on runic power. Again, this priority is shaded in red because we generally do not need to worry about it at the start of a pull. Fifth, we want to maximize our rune usage with a mix of Mara Rends to manage our Bone Shield stacks, Heart Strikes to generate higher runic power, and Blood Tap charges for extra rune regeneration. Situationally, casting Death and Decay without a Crimson Scourge proc can also fall into this category. Finally, we want to make sure that we are using our other resources, such as Blood Boil charges and Crimson Scourge procs through Death and Decay. These priorities can often be less valuable than runes, but they are still reasonably valuable, so we don't want to forget about them. In general, the main steps we are concerned about when setting up pulls in M+, are going to be generating initial Bone Shield stacks, assuming we don't have any from a previous pull, and establishing AoE threat on all enemies involved. And things only become complicated when enemies are spread out at the start of a pull, but we'll come back to that situation later. In addition to our normal priorities, there are a couple of things that we can do at the start of a pull to gain extra value. The main reason these actions are even worth doing at all is because we can often start pulls with all 6 of our runes off cooldown, or close to it, with runes generally being one of our most valuable resources. With our standard priorities, it can take a lot of time to reduce our rune count to 3 or less, which is what we need to do in order to maximize our rune regeneration. As such, if there are ways to put our runes on cooldown faster than that, we'll generate more total runes over the course of a fight than we would otherwise. Because of this, any quickly spent runes at the start of a pull aren't nearly as costly as they normally are. So, this can allow some actions to be worth doing specifically under these circumstances that otherwise would not be worth doing. The main way to take advantage of this is to use a Death and Decay to open a pull while you are still walking into that pull. This is a global cooldown we wouldn't normally be using, so there are no extra costs to this action other than the rune itself. Assuming you had 6 runes or close to it at the start of a pull, this will increase your overall damage and mitigation throughput over the course of a fight, regardless of the number of enemies. It can also help a lot with initial AoE threat generation, if that is something you are worried about. Just remember that you need to use this Death and Decay while you are walking into a pull. If you are already in melee range of an enemy, it is too late to do something like this. In a similar manner, we can use Rune Tap on pull, though this won't be as valuable if you overlap Rune Tap with another defensive ability, or if all the enemies you are fighting aren't already grouped up by the time you initiate a pull. Speaking of enemies that are not already grouped up, we're now going to talk about multi-group polling. The main issue with multi-group polls that makes them complicated is the fact that all the enemies you want to fight in the poll are all spread out at the start of it. As such, grouping all the enemies together requires a number of extra actions that we need to perform that we would otherwise not need to do. Under normal circumstances, we'd much rather follow our standard priorities to maximize our mitigation and damage throughput. It also doesn't help that our AoE threat generators, such as Blood Boil, and our defensive cooldowns, such as Dancing Rune Weapon, won't see their full value until all enemies have been grouped together. Because of this, we're a little reluctant to commit these abilities during pull setup because we'll be missing out on a lot of their value. So, where do we go from here? When setting up polls, our objectives are as follows. First, we want to get the entire poll in one place as soon as possible. The sooner everything is together, the sooner all of these problems go away, and we can go back to doing our normal rotation. Second, while doing this, we need to make sure that we have at least some threat on all of the enemies we are grouping, which means that we'll need to do some amount of damage to everything. The one exception to this is if enemies cannot reach our group members without walking through us first. In this situation, we'll have an opportunity to pick up threat on these enemies as they run through us, as long as we have a method of aggroing these groups in the first place. Third, we want to minimize the amount of resources we are spending while everything is being grouped together, since many of our abilities won't be getting full value when enemies are still spread out, as well as the fact that our survivability is going to be lower while we are taking extra actions to set up the pull. This means we'd ideally want to take as little damage as possible during the whole process to preserve our health and runic power, as well as using as few AoE and defensive abilities as possible, since we'd rather use them once all the enemies are grouped together for greater value. Now, let's talk about the abilities available to us that can be used to help set up pulls. While setting up a pull, we're normally using some combination of the following abilities. First, we have Blood Boil, which is a high threat AoE ability that can allow us to build some strong initial threat on multiple targets all at once. The only downside to this is that it has a short range, and we have limited uses of this ability. Second, we have Death and Decay, which is a ranged AoE ground ability that also has a snare that can sometimes be a good or a bad thing depending on how we are using it. While Death and Decay will establish some initial threat on all targets hit, it won't generate a large amount, since enemies will quickly move out of the ground effect after you use it. Also, it has a long enough cooldown that you will only be able to use it once during pull setup. Third, we have Death's Caress. The only redeeming qualities of Death's Caress is that it can establish moderate threat at range and it's somewhat spammable, but it's not a very efficient use of runes and it will only give you initial threat on one target at a time. So we'd rather minimize its use if at all possible. Fourth, we have our standard taunt, which doesn't generate any real threat, but it can pull things from a distance without using any cast time. This is a very efficient tool to use if aggroed enemies are forced to path through you before being able to reach allies, but it can get your allies killed if you use it in the wrong situations. Fifth, we have Death Grip. It's very similar to our standard taunt, except it brings the target directly to you, and it does take a minor amount of cast time to use. Gripping the target to you can be good in that you can quickly hit the target with blood boils, but it will increase the damage you are taking during pull setup. Finally, we have our movement abilities, Death's Advance, and if you are an engineer, the Nitro Boost Belt Enchant. These abilities have nothing to do with threat at all, but they can allow you to outrun enemies and set up pulls faster, which means you'll take noticeably less damage in the process. Speaking of nitro boosts, I want to go on a quick tangent. If you are not an engineer already, you should strongly consider becoming one for the Nitro Boosts Belt Enchant. It's a 70% movement speed buff, which is a much larger movement speed buff than Death's Advance. It lasts for 8 seconds, which is long enough to cover most applications. It only has a 2-minute cooldown, which means it can be available for every other pull. Also, it will never backfire. At least while you're in a Mythic Plus dungeon or even a raid, Nitro Boosts are 100% reliable. They can backfire in world content, but we don't really care a whole lot about that. While Nitro Boosts are tied to your potion cooldown, it will only put your potions on cooldown for 1 minute after use. As such, after using Nitro Boosts to set up a pull, your potions will often be available by the time the pull is over. So, once again, you should strongly consider becoming an engineer. Now, I'm going to go over a few examples of some of the harder pull setups to do in Shadowlands dungeons. Alright, so the first pull I want to show you guys is the Urn pull in the Ardenweald section of the other side. There are a few variations of this pull, but I'm going to show one of the more common versions. This pull is a little tricky for people because all the enemies tend to be very spread out. The first thing I'm going to do is Death and Decay the 3 patrolling birds as well as the Elderhorn patrol with the Death and Decay. This will give me some threat on all 6 of these enemies, while the snare will prevent them from reaching me for a bit while I group up the rest of the pull. At the same time, I will use Death's Advance to increase my movement speed for the following steps. Nitro Boosts may have been a better option here, but the following steps require a lot of target swapping that I wasn't confident in being able to do fast enough to take advantage of the extra movement speed. Since I have 8 stacks of Bone Shield with 10 seconds of duration left, I am able to Heart Strike the first bird instead of using a Mara Rend, but this would have been a good Mara Rend opportunity if I needed to use it for Bone Shield. For the 3 birds on the right side, I use Death's Caress, my taunt, and a Death Grip in that order. Once I'm within range of the final bird, I will use a Blood Boil, which should give me threat on that bird in addition to the 2 birds that I had used taunts on. Now I have some initial threat on everything except the final 3 stealth Spriggans near the urn, but I'm not too worried about them since I plan on moving every enemy to their location. Since all enemies are beginning to converge on my location and I'm very close to my final destination, I finally decide to use Dancing Rune Weapon before attacking the final 3 Spriggans with a second Blood Boil. From there, I can now perform my normal rotation as the final enemies trickle in. I have enough threat on everything that there shouldn't be any complications. In the next example, I'm going to use the triple pull at the start of Sanguine Depths, where I have no initial bone shield or runic power. This pull is very awkward to group up because it takes place in a very long narrow hallway, while also being a dangerous pull when grouped together. Right off the bat, I request Tiger's Lust from my monk, which is just as strong as Nitro Boosts. I want to give myself the option of using Nitro Boost later, if needed, but I don't end up using it at the end because my Draven Soulbind trait steals a movement speed buff from one of my allies, and that is enough for me to finish the pull. The first group of enemies is fairly small, so I quickly Mara Rend followed by a Blood Boil to get my Bone Shield up and running, as well as initial threat on all of these enemies. With Tiger's Lust, or Nitro Boosts if I didn't have a monk in my group, I should only eat a few of their attacks before eventually outranging them. On the next pack, I do something very specific for this pull. I first drop a Death and Decay to get threat on all of these enemies and snare them, and then I use a Gorfiend's Grasp to move them all to the side so I can walk past them on the left without eating any melee attacks. Avoiding their attacks for an extra few seconds makes this pull setup a lot easier. Finally, I use Death's Caress on the leftmost Huntsmaster, which I do on purpose so the rightmost Huntsmaster doesn't pull. On second thought, it may have been better to use a taunt here, but oh well. So, as of right now, I have initial threat on all units other than the Mist Dancer, who needs to walk through me first before he can get to other group members. And I've hardly taken any damage from anything other than a few melee attacks from the first group. The first and second groups are also pretty much grouped up even though they haven't reached me, because I snared the second group with Death and Decay. And in fact, there's nothing even within melee range of me right now. So, since everything is about to converge, I pop Dancing Rune Weapon and wait for everything to group up. I especially want to keep an eye out for the Mist Dancer since I don't have any real threat on him at all. But the job is not done with this pull, because after grouping up all the enemies as fast as I can, I still need to bring everything back within range of the urn so we can get stacks when the enemies die. Because this is Necrotic Week, I take this opportunity to reset my stacks as well while pulling everything back. After that, the pull setup is complete. The next example is an aggressive first pull in Necrotic Wake, when I have no initial Bone Shield or Runic Power at the start of an instance. First, a quick disclaimer. Even though I'm doing this pull in a Necrotic Week, I really wouldn't recommend doing this pull in a Necrotic Week ever. Even if you can get resets on these enemies, they will quickly stack you up into an unhealable range right away, and the leaping enemies just make it a huge pain to reset necrotic stacks. But regardless, it's a good example of how you can approach setting up a pull like this. I start off moving to the left pack of Blightbacks to generate initial Bone Shield stacks with a Mara Rend, followed up by a Blood Boil for initial threat. Nitro Boost is used to outrange them, and the next pack, as soon as possible. For the next four pack of soldiers that I run through, I only need to blood boil them once as I move past them. So I have threat on everything in the first two packs. My next two actions are to drop a Death and Decay on the Harvester and Vanguard pack while I taunt the Far Blight Bag pack on the right. So I have threat on everything other than the blight bags that need to move through me, and I plan to open up my normal rotation on top of the harvester and blight bag, since the harvester in particular doesn't like to move much in this pull. So I pop my cooldowns and begin my normal rotation. At this point, the pull setup is mostly done, but I also want to pick up the blight bag patrol, which I do so with a death grip on the furthest blight bag. If you pull this pack by hitting anything else other than the rightmost blight bag, you'll likely pull the gatekeeper as well, which is something you never want to do. Because I pulled this final group of blight bags with the taunt, I don't have any initial threat on them, so I'll just need to make sure that I pick them up quickly when they jump into the group. After that, the pull setup is done, and this was my last example. In conclusion, we have reviewed the standard opener, some modifications you can make at the start of pulls to improve the standard opener, the implications involved with multi-group pulls, and we have reviewed some examples of pull setups from Shadowlands dungeons. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you'd like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about setting up pulls in Mythic Plus, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.